Everyone faces giant problems in their life. In this third video in our series, How to Be a David in a World of Goliaths, we're going to see the last three principles of 6 principles, really 6 steps to overcoming giant problems in our life. And today we're going to be talking about your last 3 steps to facing a giant crisis. Have you ever really been intimidated by a giant problem that looked like it was going to just crush you under its heel, right? That's what today's video is about. We're going to be talking about the last 3 principles of 6 principles. The first one we talked about in our first week was recognize intimidation for what it is. Just intimidation. The second principle was get motivated. And then we talked about believe big based upon small past victories. And we're going to continue today with the next 3 steps in getting victory in your life over giant problems you may be facing. And we'll do that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. I'm here with my friend Jerry Duckett, and Jerry and I are going to finish this series today on how to be a David in a world of Goliaths, how to face giant crises in our life. And I've been giving principles. There are 6 steps to facing giant problems. The first week we did was recognize intimidation. And then the second week we did 2, and that was get motivated and believe big based upon small past victories. And if you haven't watched those videos, you can go back and watch. Today we're going to do the last 3 steps to facing giant problems, and we're going to do that as we go here. Are you ready for that, Jerry?
Yes, I am.
Okay, we're going to 1 Samuel 17. We're going to go from verse 38 down to verse 50 today and get into these principles as we're going, how to face giant problems in our life. Let's look at the scriptures together. We saw last week up to the point where David had gotten motivated and he said, I can do it because I did smaller victories in the past and I can do this big victory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now read 38 and 39.
Okay. Then Saul clothed David with his garments and put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with armor.
And 39.
David girded his sword over his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. So David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. And David took them off.
Now, the principle that we get here is an interesting one. When you're going into battle, stick with the weapons you know. When you're facing a giant crisis, that is not a time in your life when you say, let me try a new weapon that I've never used before, David couldn't even walk. The principle for us is don't try out new armor when you're facing a giant crisis. Stick with the weapons you know. Now, later, David used the sword and the shield and armor. But at this point of his life, he had not, and he even says, I haven't tested these. The time to try those new weapons is when you're just going along, not when you're facing a giant problem.
Not when you're in battle. No.
Yeah. So your steps is recognize intimidation. And he saw that's intimidation. That's all it is. Mm-hmm. And then get motivated and say, he is going against God and God's chosen army. Mm-hmm. And then believe big. I've killed the lion and the bear. I can kill this giant Philistine. And that's his attitude when he's going into this. And then the fourth lesson for us is when you're facing a crisis, stick with the weapons you know, and then off on the side say, I ought to be building my weapons arsenal so that when I am faced with a crisis, I can stick with the weapons I know. Be in Bible study, be in prayer on a regular basis, and stick with those weapons. But the time to try out new weapons and say, oh, I'm going to start studying the Bible now because I'm facing this giant crisis. That's not the time to do it. Our fifth principle, let's go back to the word here and see what the next principle is. And he says, okay, he took them off. In verse 40, he says, he took his stick in his hand and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's bag, which he had with him, even in his pouch. And his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistines. So this, we see the battle starting here, and he's starting to walk towards this Philistine, but he stops and he picks up 5 smooth stones. These are throwing stones that he can use in his sling, right? Now, let me ask you a question. Why did David pick up 5 stones? Did he think he was going to get 4 misses? So why do you think he picked up 5 smooth stones? And why does the Bible say specifically he picked up 5 smooth stones?
Good question, because he seems to be so precise with that first one that he didn't need them. Yet he wanted some backup. I don't know.
Oh, okay, let's look. There's very interesting verses here. We're not going to read them, but let me show you my note here. 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 16 to 22 says that Goliath had 4 giant relatives that ultimately the armies of Israel defeat. Now that's very interesting because the principle we get here from David is you got to be prepared for contingencies. Clausewitz, in his book On War, says no plan ever survives contact with the enemy. So what David was doing here by picking up 5 smooth stones, he's saying, if I need to, I'll be ready to take on not only Goliath, but also Goliath's 4 giant relatives that are standing over there. You see what I'm saying?
Gotcha. Yes.
So the principle here is when we're facing giant problems, we don't get settled in on this is the solution. Okay? We say, I'm going into battle against a giant issue in my life, and I need to live on the balls of my feet. I need to be ready to move with contingencies in case that crisis changes while I'm facing it.
Right.
You see how that applies? That really applies to the way we face a crisis. I've seen so many people say, I'm going to face this crisis, and it's got to work this way. It never works that way because the battle plan never survives contact with the enemy. So you might have a plan, but you have to be willing to go into that plan on the balls of your feet, ready to move with contingencies if that's the way that the Lord leads you. Make sense as a good principle?
Yes.
All right, so we've seen that we need to stick with weapons we know, and we need to be prepared for contingencies. Now we move on to the end of the story. It says, then the Philistine came on and approached David with his shield bearer in front of him. So we're getting a picture of this battle. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him because he was but a youth. So who's this kid? And ruddy with a handsome appearance. Now ruddy basically means he had been out in the sun. This guy, David, had been out tending sheep in the sun. And he looks and he sees this kid who's obviously this outdoors guy. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come with me with a stick? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine also said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." Now, what is he trying to do? What's the picture there?
Tries to intimidate him.
It tries to intimidate him. He said, "Who are you? You're not equipped. His brothers told him he wasn't equipped. His king told him he wasn't equipped.
Mhm.
And now Goliath is saying, man, this is going to be easy peasy. I'm going to chew you up and spit you out, and you're going to be dead, and you're going to be your flesh is going to be for the birds. They're going to pick your bones." Now, in verse 45, then David said to the Philistines, so now it's David's turn to react to this intimidation. And we're going to see David here really using some of his past principles of overcoming a giant. He said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted." Now that's back where, see his motivation there? He says, I see this is just intimidation, and I'm coming to you. My motivation is I'm coming to you in the name of the Lord. This day, this is still David speaking, this day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you, and I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know, both sides, that the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into my hands.
Yes.
Now, that's our last principle there, Jerry. And it's the principle that David is showing he is motivated. I don't have to come to you with a javelin. I can come to you with this sling and a stick in my hand. I'm not afraid, because God is the God of Israel, and you've been taunting the God of Israel, and I am motivated to come against you, and I'm going to get victory. Now, the last principle we see here, the sixth principle of facing giant crises, is we show up to the battle. David went to the battle. He went before Goliath. But we rely upon the Lord to fight the battle for us. Do you see that in there?
Yes.
He said, I'm coming to you in the name of the Lord, and I'm going to have victory because God is going to give you to me. God is going to win this battle, not me.
Yes.
Now, he's giving glory to the Lord, but he's also this idea of, I'm showing up to the battle. Now, in a crisis, what does God want me to do when I'm facing a giant crisis? Number one, don't go and hide. Show up, face the giant. But face the giant knowing that you're facing the giant with the Lord's help. And the Lord is going to give you victory. And he shows up and he gives you the victory. I want to give you some more verses. Let's look right over in here. If I'm going to show up to battle, the Lord fights the battle for me. Then I need to ask myself, who is fighting my battles? Am I allowing God to fight my battles, or am I trying to do it in my own strength? If David was trying to do it in his own strength, he'd try to be wearing Saul's armor, right? I'm gonna rely upon the weapons I don't know. I'm gonna be relying on other things to give me the victory. But no, he says, no, the Lord is going to give me victory. So we need to look to the Lord. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 57 and 58.
But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ.
Now,
Therefore,
who gives us the victory? God gives us the victory. Go ahead and keep reading.
therefore, my beloved brethren, Be steadfast, immovable, and always abounding in the works of the Lord, knowing that your toil is not in vain in the Lord.
Those are wonderful verses because it shows if you let God come to the battle and you let God fight the battle for you, all he wants from you is to be steadfast. That is, show up to the battle and let God win it for you. And there are some other verses here. Stop the recording. Look those up. Spend a little time. Look up Isaiah 41, 10 through 14. We're not going to look at it today. It talks about victory. And the victory is not because we're hot shots. It's because we rely upon the Lord. The 6 steps for looking at a giant problem in our life and overcoming that giant problem. The first principle is recognize intimidation, and all it is intimidation. The second principle is get motivated. This does not please God. If I give in, this is not going to be pleasing to God. Who does this crisis think he is by going against me, who's a child of God? And then the third one is, I want to make sure that's believe big based upon small past victories. So I've been getting small victories in my life in the past, so God can give me a bigger victory. And then the fourth principle is stick with weapons you know. The fifth principle is be prepared for contingencies. Live on the balls of your feet, ready to go whichever direction the Lord wants. And the last one is show up to the battle, but let the Lord fight the battle for you. And he shows up. And I have faced many a giant circumstances in my life, and I know you have too, Jerry. And these are principles that will help you face these giant, whatever the circumstances are. Family, friends, work, relationship, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I have found these 6 principles from God's word to be principles we can go to battle. And it's very interesting from these verses that then David goes to the battle. And let's look at this. I think it's funny. Because it says in verse 48, 49, and 50. Let's read this together. Then it happened when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag, and he took from it a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him, but there was no sword in David's hand. Now, what I find interesting there, Jerry, is the conclusion of this big, huge battle, this big story through 1 Samuel 17 of David facing Goliath. The victory was anticlimactic. It's like, so then David ran up and killed him. And there's just not a lot there
Right.
other than the victory.
Right.
And I really see from that the point of this story isn't David and Goliath, the story of how David defeated Goliath, but it's really the story of what led up to that victory. And I think the 6 principles, and then David had victory. Okay.
Yes.
Now, any concluding reaction to the 6 principles, to the story of David and Goliath? Anything soak into you? Anything really stick out to you in the story?
Several things. One, the preparation that had to go into it mentally for him to be able to accomplish what he did. It was like he knew what worked and what didn't work for him.
Yeah.
And he went with what worked.
Yes, and there had to have been a spiritual foundation for David. Now we know that's the truth because when he was off shepherding the sheep, he would write these fantastic songs to God. So he had this ongoing relationship with God. And then Samuel anoints him king, and he's waiting. He's waiting on God to do that. So David had a spiritual foundation in order to do these 6 things. It wasn't just coming out of nowhere. So the question to ask ourselves is, have I prepared my soul? Have I prepared my mind for these 6 principles? So that's a great observation, that David had a foundation of faith in God and a trust in God that led to his understanding of these 6 principles.
Approach somebody close to 10 feet tall with a sling and a rock, thinking this is going to do anything.
Yeah. And you talk about being outnumbered and outclassed, not if God is fighting on your side. Because as much as Goliath is over David, God is way bigger than Goliath and Goliath's 4 relatives. And we find out that over the next few years, David and his army do face the other 4 relatives and have to dispatch them also. So the battle continues. It isn't that David will never face another crisis. Yes, he will. He faces all kinds of crises coming up. But these principles build on his foundation of faith, and it will build on our foundation of faith. So listen, I hope this has been a blessing to you on YouTube. And I hope this has given you some principles to think about in your life. Look over these 3 videos that we've done and look at these principles as it applies to you and any giant problem that you might face. And listen, this has been a great series, and I appreciate you, Jerry, for helping me with this series and these 6 principles. Well, today we've been talking about victory when facing giant problems. We've seen 6 principles that David used in his life that really produced a victory that God gave him, not one that he produced on his own strength. I want to recommend a video to you called God's Battle Armor for Every Believer. It's out of the book of Ephesians. It talks about the armor of God. I think this video will be a blessing to you. We're going to continue with a completely new study next week. And until then, God bless you.